This video is going to be on parking brake systems, fundamentals, and service. Now, we can't cover all the different types of parking brake systems that there are out there, but we're going to take a look at the function of how some of them work and what is the purpose behind them. So for instance, if we take an automotive parking brake system, the pedal is pushed in, and what's going to happen when we do that is it's going to go back to the rear wheels and apply our brakes. Now, parking brake setups vary between manufacturers and how they work. For instance, if we have an automatic transmission, we might have a parking pawl in it. And what that does is it locks the transmission so it can't turn, and hence it's not going to allow the wheels to move. But as we get into bigger vehicles, they don't use parking poles, so we're going to have a parking brake setup. Now, one of the things we have to be aware of is when we're doing any work to these vehicles, we have to make sure that we block the wheels so that the vehicle can't roll. And I'll get into a little bit more of that as we start to go through this short video. So as the pedal is pushed, what happens in the back of the parking brake is it will apply the shoes. So the shoes that we use for making a brake application are the same shoes that are used to hold the vehicle while we're parked. Other types of setups are they'll use spring pressure, much the same as they do for air brakes, except they're using hydraulic pressure to release the brakes. So when we start up the vehicle, we push in the button or turn on the switch. It's going to take power steering fluid, and that power steering fluid is going to compress a spring, which then releases the brakes. So they're spring applied, hydraulically released. We have to really be aware when we're working on this style of chamber. They're called a roto chamber. Because there's a big spring in there that makes a park application, we want to make sure if we ever take a roto chamber apart that we cage the roto chamber before we take it apart. That will prevent that spring from coming apart and hurting you. We're going to see this same type of spring setup when we get into air brakes. Another type of brake assembly is a hydraulic lock. Now, these aren't legal on the highway, but what it does is it's also called a line lock. And how it works is we make a brake application, we have a valve that we flip over, and it hydraulically locks the brakes. Now, what is the drawback of one of these? Well, what happens if we have a small leak in a piston? Because it's hydraulic pressure that's making the application, that could bleed off in a period of time and we could have a rollaway. So this is a different type of a parking brake, but it still uses a big spring. And this uses a wedge style braking system, which you really don't see too much anymore. So what we're doing is using a big spring again to create the pressure to apply the brakes. Now, to release the brakes, we have to add hydraulic pressure to the system, and this will release the brakes. Now, one of the most commons when we're dealing with 5-ton vehicles is an internal drum that locks the drive shaft from turning. And inside the cab there's going to be a hand control that we can pull in to lock the drive shaft up. Now, here's where we run into problems. If we have to do any work on the drive shaft and we have to take it out, we run the risk of having the vehicle move on us if we don't block it up. So one of the things that they've done now is they've taken the drum and they've moved it to the very rear of the vehicle, right on to the drive axle. So on the input of the differential, that's where the brake is now. So if any work has to be done to the driveline, transmission, or engine, we're not disabling it. So for instance, if I have to remove a driveline, I don't run the risk of having a vehicle move if I forget to block it. So paying attention to how the braking system, parking braking system is set up, and make sure that any time that we are working on a vehicle that we always block the wheels. Even if it's only for a few minutes, always remember, block the wheels. Better to be safe than have a vehicle roll over on you. So different types of brake that we're going to see. This is an internal brake drum, very much like the ones we have on the wheels. So as we apply the brakes, the shoes are going to go out against the drum and lock it in place. The other type we have an external band. So instead of it moving out, it moves in and compresses against the drum. Now all of these are on the back of the transmission. So a couple of things we have to be aware of is rear transmission seal leaks could affect the braking action of our parking brake. Making sure that these are, because they're a dry lining, if we get oil on them, it could cause a vehicle to roll away. When we take a look at vehicles that use hydraulic pressure, there's a couple different types. Again, we talked about the ones that use power steering fluid to release the brake system. Some of the others will have an independent parking brake system. So when I push the button in, the pump actually builds pressure to release the brakes. Once it gets to a certain pressure, there's a pressure switch on there. It'll turn the pump off so the pump isn't continually running. If the pressure bleeds off, the pump will come back on and release the brakes. Again, when we're looking at parking brakes that are on the back of the transmission, we have to ensure that we block the wheels so that we don't take it, so it doesn't roll away on us. Now, what about setting parking brakes? Well, there's a couple different ways that we can go in and we can actually set the parking brake up. So there's a hole in the drum, and we can go in with adjusting tool, much like we do on a normal pickup or automotive brake system. We have an adjusting tool, and what we want to do is we want to adjust that shoe so it's as close to the drum, but not dragging on the drum that's going to generate heat, because again, if we're going to generate heat, what's going to happen is that drum's going to expand. Other types of adjusters are in the handle itself or in the linkage somewhere. So we may have to go in and adjust the linkage. One of the things we should be paying attention to over a period of time is, because most of the linkages aren't lubricated, we're going to start to get wear in our pins and bushings, and also our cables are going to stretch over a period of time. So we want to ensure that all of these components are looked after and maintained. Brake adjustments, again, on an external bands type. For the most part, they're fairly easy to adjust, but it's always best to use the manufacturer's recommendations on how to adjust them, because there may be a sequence of adjustments that it may not work properly if we don't follow their procedure. So again, different types of adjusters. On this adjuster here, this is hooked to a hydraulic cable, and again, all of our linkage has to be adjusted properly in order for these to work. Inside the cab, some of them can be adjusted with a knob. The knob will turn, and as it turns, it will make fine adjustments as the brake starts to wear. But once the knob gets to a certain point, we can't adjust it anymore. Then we have to physically go down to where the parking brake is and make some adjustments on a yoke down below. We've already talked about roto chambers again, and they're usually only on the drive axle. And this is what the internal part of a roto chamber looks like. Again, How you tell a roto chamber from a different parking brake chamber is the bolts run on the outside. And again, anytime we're working on these, we should know what components are on there to make sure that we don't hurt ourselves. Adjusting cables, again, we don't want it too loose, but we don't want it too tight so that it's dragging. You know, if it's too loose and we make a brake application, we could still have a rollaway. If it's too tight, it's going to drag. So again, making sure we have the correct adjustment. There are some parking brake electronic control modules that you're going to see in some of the newer vehicles. So the ECM will, when it's parked, is going to control that. And part of that is an electric driven parking brake hydraulic pump. So the big thing with when we're dealing with parking brake systems is make sure we block the vehicle so it's safe to work on any of the systems that we're working on. Make sure we follow manufacturer's directions on how to adjust the parking brake system. Inspection and maintaining them, make sure that the brake shoes aren't contaminated. So again, most of this is a visual inspection. So understanding how the parking brake system works on a hydraulic park brake system. We're going to get into air brake systems next, and their systems are set up a little different.